Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Meryl Fulb. I'm a consultant to the ISE. Welcome on a pretty chilly afternoon to our webinar, one of the last few of the year. I'm very excited to have one of my colleagues from the ISE join us today, Tristan Hooley. He's the Chief Research Officer for the ISE, and he's going to be talking to us around recruitment and salaries, basically. So I'm not going to belabor the point for much longer. I'm going to hand over to Tristan shortly. Just so you know, if you do have any particular questions, feel free to put them into the question bar. If you want to keep them until the end of the session, that's fine too. And I will either answer them myself if they're just administrative questions. Otherwise, I will also bring them to Tristan's attention throughout the session if there's something urgent with regards to a slide. Yeah, Tristan, handing over to you.
Great, well, thank you for having me on the webinar. So I'm going to spend hopefully about probably half an hour presenting some of the findings from our survey. So I joined the ISE about 6 weeks ago, and one of the first things that I did was to work to do some analysis and writing on the recruitment survey that we do every year. And so what I'm going to present you is a sort of top level overview of this. As Meryl said, we're very happy to take questions either throughout or at the end, and I'll stay on the line a bit longer at the end to answer any of those. But I also work quite closely with ISE members. If you've got particular questions that relate to any of the things I've talked about and you'd like me to have a look into it a bit more, then feel free to give me an email. So if we get started, our survey is it's an annual event. We run it for 4 weeks every year, and it's our members mainly who provide information for this. So this year we had 138 responses, which cover 32,000 hires, represent 17 sectors. And if you want to see the whole report, it's on the website. So we'll dive straight in. So the first thing is that there was clear evidence in our survey that recruitment's carrying on, that most of our employers are still recruiting graduates, about half recruiting apprentices, and then sort of 2/3 bringing in interns over the summer. There weren't that many bringing in school leaver direct entry, but one of the reasons we think for that is that a lot of the school leaver programs are kind of merging into the apprenticeship programs. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at in the future. So graduates are only part of the picture. So we've seen all types of recruitment go up this year from last year. But when we look at it across the different types of recruitment, we can see that the apprenticeships and school leavers figures are clearly the kind of biggest growth area. So although people were recruiting more graduates this year than they had done last year, they were recruiting a lot more apprentices and school leavers than they were last year. And that's starting from a much lower base. So it doesn't mean that people are recruiting more apprenticeships, and it certainly doesn't mean that the graduate market is drying up. But this is an important trend for us to look at over the long run, because it may signal some shifts that are going on. One of the things that we found that was really important to employers in a more strategic sense was that many employers were quite concerned about levels of diversity within their workforce. And so most employers then told us that they were prioritizing diversity and that they were changing both their attraction and marketing and their recruitment and selection. So real sense of some activities going on. And if we wanted to look at what issues they were most concerned at, this chart shows us here, and the ones that are giving high priorities, we've ranked it in that order. So gender was the thing that's concerning people most, then ethnicity, social mobility, disability, and sexual orientation. So these are issues that people are thinking about, almost all of these, because there's very few people on all of these really who are saying these are not a priority. So strategically, obviously, in order to deliver this recruitment activity that we're discussing, there's a real need for employers to have appropriate teams. What we found was that the average employer that we're working with employs about 6 people, probably bringing in about 3 external people. They're spending about £2,000 for every hire, and but many of them are trying to actually reduce costs. So that's a kind of an area of concern for people. So if we look at focusing on the attraction, what we can see is that there's a very clearly structured and patterned employer recruitment campaign, which you'll be very familiar with, I think, which is kind of opening either over the summer or in the autumn and making most of the offers in the kind of early spring. So what we say is that if you haven't got an offer as a student by the time you get to say Easter, you're kind of going to struggle to find an offer, really. So very clear pattern for graduates, but apprenticeship campaigns not so patterned at all. And this seems to me an area that's worth thinking about more, because obviously one of the attractions of having some kind of structure to the campaign is it gives both candidates and educational institutions a way of understanding how best to interact with employers. And that was much less likely to be true for apprenticeships. Another thing that we found out in terms of the attraction and marketing was that very few employers were particularly interested in recruiting overseas candidates, such as international students, and very few were actively targeting postgraduates. Now, that didn't mean that postgraduates weren't being employed, but they weren't actively targeting that group. So if we look at the kind of attraction and marketing activities people are doing, there's very much a kind of belt and braces approach going on here. We see all the different sort of approaches that people are using, being used by most employers. So jobs boards, visits, print media, social media, and so on. We see a few things that are particularly used with apprenticeships. So, for example, using training providers to recruit, or talking to parents would be another area where that's probably not appropriate for graduates, but it is something that many of the people who are recruiting apprentices were doing. At the heart of a lot of this attraction and marketing is employers still very much working to build relationships with employers, often working, well, on average, working with
Tristram, the sound has gone. Have you muted yourself at all? This is very odd. We had this issue 2 weeks ago as well, and I just don't know what it is. Tristram, I'm going to try, sorry audience, I'm going to try and fix this up now. Tristram, I'm going to uninvite you and re-invite you again as a presenter, just to see if that helps at all. Tristram, I can't seem to even do that. It's not letting me have access to that. I'm just going to try one more thing. Sorry everyone, give me 2 minutes just to see if I can try and get this right. Just trying to bring Tristram back. all very strange. Just waiting for Tristan to log in again. Please bear with me just another 1 or 2 minutes, hoping that he's going to come back online. Okay, I don't know what's happened to Tristan because he's not answering his phone either. I'm going to give it another minute and then we'll see what we can, and we'll make a decision from there. Sorry, everyone. Do you want to respond to my question in the questions box and just let me know what your thoughts are? I haven't got Tristan back. Do you want to hold on for another few minutes? Another, I would say, 2 to 3 minutes. Unfortunately, this happened 2 weeks ago. I thought we'd solved the problem, but it seems to have happened again. It's out of our control. It is the platform that we are using. So it's a tech fail. That's the only thing we can figure out it to be, at least. Tristan's busy phoning me. Hi. Hi everyone, give us another minute. Tristan and I are just talking on the phone. I had put myself on mute. He's going to try log in again. I'll be with you in a minute. I just want to finish the call. Okay. Hello, everyone. We've got Tristram back. I think he's just loading up his presentation and give us a minute, and then we hopefully should be able to start again. Thank you for your patience. Tristram, I think I can hear you.
Okay, hi there. Yes.
Okay.
Right, so let me just get the screen up. And okay, right. So where had we got up to before you lost me?
We lost you about, no, we've heard definitely go back to the original slide that you had left off on, and that's where we lost you.
Okay, so down to here, yes? Internships.
I think so, yes. All
right, well, I'm very sorry about that. We'll try and push on. So what I was really saying was that internships are pretty healthy this year. Most employers are recruiting both summer interns and year-long placements, and then they're rehiring about half of these people back into their firms. So if we then look at the apprenticeship and school leaver elements of this, what we can see is that we've got generally an increase, as we've already talked about, in terms of the number of apprenticeships and school leavers. And this runs against the national trend. So ISE members are a bit different from a standard employer in that you're probably more used to working with structured programs with young people because of your experience in graduate recruitment. And it looks like that's something which is serving you well in apprenticeships, because whereas most companies would report the number of apprenticeships pretty stable or even in decline, here we're seeing people using them more. But it's only really still a fraction of what you're potentially could do with your apprenticeship levy. So only 15% of the amount that businesses are spending of their apprenticeship levy is actually being spent. So the average apprenticeship salary is about 16,500 and school leaver salary about 15,000. And one of the things that we can say is the engagement with apprenticeships varies very considerably by sector. So if we move on to graduates now, one of the things we can see is that graduate salaries have pretty consistently gone up over the last few years if we look at them straightforwardly. Now the blue line here is the ISE salaries that you're reporting. The red line is the general graduate salaries, which are kind of steadily ticking up to something like £22,000 a couple of years ago, which is the last data that we've got. So what this is telling us is that ISE employers, the graduate scheme type employers, are good employers who are offering good packages in comparison with the rest of the graduate labour market. However, when we index link this, we start to see that it's perhaps not quite as positive a picture as we might have seen from the graduate point of view. So graduates are probably, if anything, a little bit worse off than they were sort of 10 years ago. And the kind of decline in salaries that came after the crash has only really just started to kind of recover, really. So this is important, and it's something for us to keep an eye on, is whether the salaries that we're offering are really at the levels that we would that they need to be to allow us both to be competitive in the market, but also to give graduates a decent standard of living. So another thing that we found in the survey is that graduates are quite concentrated in London. This is something I want to do some more analysis and research on, because I think there's certainly a possibility this is less the case than in previous years, but there's still very strong concentration in London, and then kind of people pretty spread out across the rest of the country. So to finish up, I think there's a number of different types of recruitment that have gone up this year, but apprenticeships and school leaver direct routes are growing most rapidly. And I think one of the things that I think as a result of that is that if the apprenticeship levy has the desired effect, that this may continue to grow much more into the future. And as a result of this, we might see a difference in the balance between the apprenticeship part of this young labour market and the graduate part of it. I mean, as I say, that is not really happening yet, but there's certainly some signals from our surveys that might be something that is worth keeping an eye on. A second big conclusion that I'd try and draw from this is that diversity is a very key issue of concern for employers of all types. Many are changing their marketing, attraction and recruitment approaches in response to these issues, but there's actually fairly limited amount of evidence that this is having quite the effect that people are hoping. And so this is something that we're sort of keeping a very close eye on, and I think it's something that we've certainly been talking about in a lot of the groups that have been meeting in ISE, is what more we can do to support diversity. One thing that I would say in kind of response to that, I suppose, is that we also need to remember that employers can't shoulder the full burden for a diverse society, and that much of the diversity that employers are, much of the lack of the diversity that employers are reporting reflects very much lack of diversity that we see in other aspects of society, so in the education system and so on. So we need to think about that and think about what the employer's unique role is in trying to challenge this. Employers continue to invest in recruitment activities, and so you're reporting that you've still got teams doing this, you're still spending money and so on in terms of doing quite a wide range of different recruitment and attraction activities. However, half of the respondents to the survey also revealed that they're very keen to look for savings. And then finally, I think ISE members are good employers who offer generous reward packages in comparison with the rest of the labour market, and particularly the graduate labour market, but they've still not made up for the big fall in salaries that happened post 2008. So I think there are some questions that this poses for us that we might want to think about more, and people may have questions to ask or points to make on these things. So one question is will apprenticeship routes continue to grow? I've talked about this quite a bit, but it's an important one, and it really is very bound up with whether employers are able to successfully find ways to spend their apprenticeship levy. Secondly, I think, can employers crack the diversity issues that they're concerned with? We've got a lot of activity. There's some questions about how far this is translating through into actually shifting the diversity within firms. How will employers' overall approach to recruitment change? I think there's quite a lot of evidence here that suggests that there's an awful lot of stability over a number of years. And while there are some new techniques being used, particularly a lot of online techniques, and some new approaches like the strengths-based approaches that people talk about, there's not really strong evidence that we're seeing a kind of radical shift in the way recruitment is done. There's, I think, another important question, which is how you can build the most effective partnerships with education, given that we've seen that those partnerships are so critical to the attraction and marketing of new student hires. And then, will the packages offered to graduates need to change? And will questions of geography become more important? And certainly the government, through the Office for Students, thinks that they probably should become more important, and that we should start to think about how we balance the labour market away from London. So these are all sorts of questions that we might want to be thinking about in the future. So I said, there's my contact details. If people want to contact me, then please just send me an email. You can also have a look at my blog or engage with me on Twitter. But I'm very happy to take any questions now if people have got any.
Tristram, I was busy logging a call with Grow to Webinars when you started your presentation. Your presentation again, we had missed out a couple of slides before the internship one, apparently. So a couple of people said that we lost it. So sorry, do you mind going back a bit? I'll tell you. I think I know where we might have stopped.
Well, that's no problem.
Our usual webinar. Apologies for this. It's just we've had a few sound issues. And go back further. I don't think we've got to this. No, we passed that. Sorry.
Okay. So we're talking here about different types of attraction. We then talked about recruitment and selection approaches. And
I think we might have lost you. Yes, we went past this as well.
So what we would talk about here was how different types of recruitment.
I think we've lost you over here, somewhere around here.
Okay.
One thing, I've got it wrong. Please feel free to message.
Okay, so what we were saying here was that employers are setting a variety of things as minimum requirements, and so using degrees and A levels, and some focusing on will only recruit from particular disciplines and so on. But we're also seeing a trend that a growing number are not setting minimum requirements in an attempt to kind of, partly as a response to various criticisms that are made from a sort of social justice point of view, that we don't want to exclude people just because they've perhaps not had so many advantages at school or been to the top university. So people are starting to not set minimum requirements, and the sort of business rationale for that would be that there is a value in opening up your recruitment to as wide a group of people as possible, and then you can use your own selection requirements. I then talked a little bit about student responses, so particularly changes in the number of applications, and what we argued here, and we've done analysis looking at two different ways of calculating the average here, but essentially what we're seeing is not a radical change in the number of applicants per job here. So I think the median, which is the way we've moved to calculating it this year, is probably a better way to describe it, because it smooths out some of the outliers a bit more. And what we're seeing is that sort of around about between 40 and 50 applications per job is what we've kind of seen each year. The other thing that we looked at was people have been very interested in this. This is not actually in the report, this is analysis I've done subsequently, is that the issue of acceptances, declines, deferred and reneged offers. And what we're seeing here, and we didn't ask last year about the deferred offers, and so we probably would see them sort of put into the acceptances last year, but I think it is important to pull those out as well. But what we're seeing here is that the number of declines and the number of deferrals, and the number of reneges have both increased, and the number of acceptances has decreased. And so what this suggests to me is that the labour market is quite strong, but there's a level of balance here. So as an employer, you can expect to get 40 or 50 applicants for every job. So that would suggest that you're doing pretty well, you're in a pretty strong position. But the fact that about a third of people are not really accepting the offers that you've given them, at least not straight away, suggests that your bargaining position in the labour market might be a bit weaker than that number of applications per job actually suggests. So that was what we were talking about here. I then talked about internships. I think, was this where we picked up? I don't know, but anyway, so we then sort of talked about internships and then about apprenticeships and so on. So I don't know whether there's any questions that people have got, particularly in response to any of that. No?
Okay, I've got a question here. Are ISE employers using the apprenticeship levy to upskill their current employees and offer them CPD through the apprenticeship levels, mainly from 4 to 7? And that's from Catherine Hodgson of the University of Derby.
Right, so we aren't sure exactly the proportions that apprenticeships, the apprenticeship levy is being spent on. What we would expect is that most employers are using a lot of their apprenticeship levy for on-the-job training of existing employees, and that will vary a lot depending on apprenticeship standards and frameworks that are available across different sectors. But yes, so when people are talking about apprenticeship levy, we don't think that is not generally going to be used exclusively to bring in young new hires. But the figures that we've reported on apprentices being hired is that young new hires. So we are seeing a substantial increase in the number of new hires who are being brought in on the apprenticeship thing. But yes, we absolutely expect that employers will be spending some of that on existing hires. One of the things that we're quite interested in, and we've seen some sort of anecdotal evidence that this is starting to take place, or at least that employers are thinking about it, is whether some employers are going to transform their graduate schemes into level 6 or 7 apprenticeships. And we think that that will happen, and that there is some evidence that it's starting to happen, and it's something that we're going to investigate further in future research.
Okay, great. Then I've got a question from Gary Argent. Could you go through the slide about applications for vacancy again?
Sure, yes, absolutely, yeah. So the application for vacancy slide, where are we? Let's go back to that. So what we're seeing is, so what we do is we ask people how many applications they got, and we ask people how many jobs have you, or how many posts have you awarded, or how many job offers have you made. So, and we essentially divide one of those figures by the others to get a ratio. And what that ratio tells us is that we then add those things together to create an average. And there's two ways of creating an average, or two ways that we've used here. The first one is a mean. And what we do in that is we add all of these different answers that people give us. So some people might have said, well, for every job we had 10 applicants. And other people might have said, well, for every job we had 1,000 applicants. Because maybe they're a very high prestige employer that they don't have that many opportunities. And then we would average all of those out just by adding them up and dividing them by the number of employers who responded to that question. And that gives us the mean. And the mean then is saying that it's sort of between, well, around about 75 to 80 across the last 2 years of applications. What I think is better is to use the median, which is where we line all of those different numbers up in order, and when we pick the number that's in the middle. And that's a better way of working out the average for this sort of thing, I think, because it smooths out some of those really outlying huge numbers or very, very small numbers, and allows us to pick the number that's sort of more typical. And I think this is a more typical number. If you're a standard employer, you can probably expect between 40 and 50 applications per job that you have, rather than 70 to 80. So that's how we've worked it out, and that's been a change in the way we've calculated the average this year.
Okay, great. I'm just checking if any more questions have come through. Then I think I've got one. With more grads seeming to live at home, is there an issue with regionalized graduate vacancy availability? That is from Andy Howard.
Yeah, it's absolutely an issue. One of the things that there's some analysis that Charlie Ball has done recently. I don't know whether Charlie's in this webinar at all, but he's looked at these issues and found that the graduates are not as mobile as we thought they were. And you can actually see this if you go on the ISE website and you look at some statistics around graduate employability in different regions. What you can see is that pretty much most people who work somewhere either grew up in that place or they went to university there. And very few people move completely to somewhere new which they didn't grow up in or go to university in. So what we're seeing there is that if graduate mobility is not as high, often we assume that graduates are completely mobile, but if it's not as high as we thought, then the fact that all the jobs, or a very large proportion of the jobs, are located in London obviously creates some inequalities that people might want to think about. And probably more importantly than the inequality aspect, there's also a set of concerns which would come from local policymakers, like the local enterprise partnerships, who would say, we actually want to retain our skills in the area where we are because we've got use for them here. So that would be another important issue that's being thought about. And as I mentioned as we were going through, a number of policies are coming out which are trying to address this. and I think this is something that the businesses might want to be thinking about, is actually, do they need to suck people into London quite as much as they are doing, or would it be possible to rethink their graduate recruitment in ways that allow them to disperse graduates more broadly around the country?
Great, thank you. I've got a question from Scarlett at PwC. Are we worried at all about the increase in apprenticeships and the impact on gender diversity, mainly because apprenticeship/school leaver applicants will tend to be more male heavy?
I'd be interested to see whether that's been found. I mean, in fact, what some of the research on apprenticeships says is that apprenticeship routes do tend to be quite gendered. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are more men than women doing apprenticeships, but the type of apprenticeships they're doing do tend to be quite gendered, and I think that would be very sector specific. So if, for example, if we were in engineering, we would expect, based on the kind of research, we would expect that a lot of the apprenticeships would be quite male dominated. That might not be the case in the same way in, say, retail. So these would be, I think it's going to be very sector specific. So whether apprenticeships are bad for gender equality, say further up a firm, if firms started reducing their graduate intake and relying entirely on apprenticeships, I think it is a good question. It is possible that one of the effects of that would be a sort of reducing in sort of gender diversity, but I haven't actually looked at that. I think that's a very interesting issue, though.
Although it must probably be affected by your diversity elements might be met with looking at the social mobility scales. People who might do apprenticeships might be lower on the social mobility scale. So you may reduce one level of one track of diversity, but increase on the other. I don't know.
Yeah, well, so there's yeah, I mean that's certainly possible. So there's lots of different features to diversity, and it's possible that things can work in favour of diversity in one direction but against it in the other direction. That's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I think is going to be important here is because the number of apprentices at the moment is not that high. So we're still talking about quite low levels of apprenticeships, especially the higher end of the apprenticeship market. So the level 3, 4 and up apprenticeship routes. Whether that actually does serve to sort of change the social makeup of firms, I think it still sort of remains to be seen, really.
Okay, great. I've got one question, Tristram, a bit on the spot. Are you comfortable if we have to share these slides? Oh
yes, yeah, the slides can be shared, absolutely, yeah.
If you could send that to me, and then I'll send it to everyone that registered on the webinar as well.
And also, I mean, with one or two exceptions of new pieces of analysis that I've done, everything is in the report that we put out, and so we may want to circulate the report alongside this. What I would say is that it's been very interesting is a number of members have contacted me and asked me more detailed questions, and I've tried to then get back to people. Sometimes it's a question of interpretation, but in many cases I've done additional analysis to look at some of those things. So I'm very happy to do that if it's helpful to members.
That's great. There we are, everyone. You have a very, very open mandate to go and contact Tristram directly and ask any particular questions. He's even volunteered to do some extra analysis if he can. So that's great. Once more, I apologize for the blip in the sound and in the slides. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for joining us. Apologies to you as well, Tristram, especially for your first webinar. Need to go to webinar now and asking them how they can sort out this problem, because it's the second time it's happened to us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend. Please visit the ISE website to see what other webinars we're running. We have one scheduled on the 4th of December as well as on the 7th of December. Please look at them. Feel free to register, and we'll start advertising our webinars for next year in the next couple of weeks. Thanks.
Great.
Bye.